The day Claire Donovan walked out of the orphanage, everything she owned fit inside one worn-out suitcase. She thought she was leaving with nothing. But before the day was over, a lawyer handed her the keys to an old bakery, left to her by a woman she had never met. The bakery looked abandoned. Yet hidden inside was the answer to a question Claire had been asking her whole life. Why had she been chosen? She believed she had inherited an old building. She had no idea she was about to uncover a legacy that would change her life forever. Stay with me, because this story isn't really about a bakery. It's about discovering where we truly belong. There are moments in life when the world doesn't end with a loud crash. Sometimes, it ends with the quiet sound of a door closing behind you. That was the sound Claire Donovan carried with her on the morning she left St. Anne's Children's Home for the last time. She was 19 years old. Everything she owned fit inside a single worn suitcase, its edges softened by years of being packed and unpacked. A faded denim jacket rested over one arm, and in her pocket was just enough money for a bus ticket, and maybe a cup of coffee if she was careful. No parents were waiting. No relatives had called. No one stood outside the gate to wish her luck. The director hugged her tightly before she left. "You've always had a kind heart, Claire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Promise me you won't let this world harden it." Claire smiled the best she could. But when the bus finally pulled away, she turned toward the window and quietly wiped away tears no one else would ever see. It wasn't fear that made her cry. It was the painful realization that she had nowhere to go, and no place she truly belonged. For 19 years, the orphanage had been the closest thing she had ever known to home. Now, even that chapter was over. The bus traveled through winding country roads lined with old maple trees until it reached a quiet little town nestled between gentle hills. Maple Creek. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared on postcards. Just one main street, a white church with a weathered steeple, a family-owned hardware store, a small diner where the same customers probably sat in the same booths every morning. The kind of town where neighbors still waved from their front porches and remembered your birthday without needing a reminder. Claire had never planned to come here. She had intended to keep traveling until she found any job that would let her start over. But 3 days earlier, life had quietly taken a turn she never could have imagined. Just hours before leaving the orphanage, a lawyer arrived carrying a worn leather folder. Inside was the final will and testament of a woman Claire had never heard of, Helen Whitaker. According to the documents, Helen had owned a small bakery on Willow Street for more than 40 years, and for reasons no one could explain, she had left the entire bakery to Claire Donovan. Even the lawyer looked puzzled. "I handled Miss Whitaker's legal affairs for nearly 2 decades," he admitted. "I never once heard her mention your name." Then he slid a small envelope across the table. This was found with her will. Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten note. No greeting. No explanation. Only one sentence. "Please don't sell the bakery. Stay for 90 days, and you'll understand why I chose you." That was it. No signature. No answers. Only a mystery. Most people would have refused. An old bakery in a town they'd never visited sounded more like a burden than a blessing. But Claire had spent her entire life wondering what it felt like. To be chosen. To matter to someone. So she came. The taxi stopped in front of a narrow brick building at the end of Willow Street. The faded sign above the entrance still read, "Whitaker's Bakery." Several letters had fallen away with time. One front window was cracked. The paint around the door had peeled beneath decades of rain, snow, and summer heat. A handwritten sign hung crookedly inside the glass. "Closed until further notice. Claire stood on the sidewalk without moving. "So, this is really mine," she whispered. The driver nodded. "Been closed almost a year." He glanced toward the building before adding quietly, "Most folks figured it'd be torn down by now." Claire looked at the old bakery again. It certainly wasn't beautiful anymore. Not on the outside, but something about it didn't feel forgotten. It felt as though it had been waiting. She unlocked the front door. The little brass bell above it gave a soft ring that echoed through the empty shop. The air carried the faint scent of flour, old wood, vanilla, and memories that refused to disappear. Dust covered the display cases. The chairs rested upside down on the tables. A calendar still hung on the wall, its pages frozen nearly a year in the past. Time itself seemed to have stopped inside those walls. Claire slowly walked behind the old wooden counter. She ran her fingertips across its worn surface. Someone had stood here every morning for decades, greeting neighbors by name, wrapping birthday cakes with care, quietly slipping an extra cookie into a child's paper bag. Someone had built an entire life inside this little bakery. "So why me?" Claire whispered into the silence. The empty room offered no answer, only stillness. Across the street, an elderly man paused for a moment, looking through the front window. He shook his head gently before walking away. Claire never noticed him. She was too busy looking around the little bakery that had somehow become hers. She had no idea, that somewhere inside those aging walls, hidden beneath decades of flour, faded recipes, and forgotten memories, was the answer to the question she had carried in her heart her entire life. Not only, why did Helen Whitaker choose me? But something even more important. Where does a person find a family when they've never truly had one? And before those 90 days came to an end, Claire Donovan would discover that the greatest treasure waiting inside Whitaker's bakery had never been the bread, or the recipes, or the business itself. It was something far more precious, something that had quietly changed the lives of countless strangers, and was about to change hers forever. The first morning, Claire Donovan woke above the old bakery. She wasn't sure where she was. For one peaceful second, she forgot she no longer belonged to St. Anne's Children's Home. Then she heard the old building settling around her. A floorboard creaked somewhere downstairs. The pipes gave a tired groan inside the walls. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled slowly past the front window, and reality quietly returned. The bakery, the will, the 90 days. Claire pulled herself from the narrow bed in the tiny apartment above the shop. It wasn't much a small bedroom, an old rocking chair by the window, a kitchen barely large enough for one person, but it was the first place in her life that belonged to no one else. She stood at the window for a long moment. Morning sunlight stretched across Willow Street. An elderly couple walked hand in hand toward the diner. The mailman waved to nearly everyone he passed. Somewhere nearby, church bells chimed 9 o'clock. Maple Creek moved at a slower pace than the rest of the world. Claire wasn't sure if she liked that yet. She pulled on an oversized sweater, tied her hair into a loose ponytail, and walked downstairs. The little brass bell above the bakery door gave another soft ring as she unlocked it for the first time. No customers came. No one even looked inside. The bakery remained exactly as Helen Whitaker had left it. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Old cake stands sat empty inside the display cases. A faded chalkboard still listed prices that hadn't changed in years. Apple pie, $8.50. Cinnamon rolls sold out. Fresh bread. Every Friday. Claire smiled sadly. It feels wrong to erase any of this. She found a broom leaning against the pantry wall and quietly began sweeping. There was nothing glamorous about restoring an old bakery. She scrubbed flour that had hardened beneath shelves years ago. She washed windows until her arms ached. She polished display cases no one was looking at. By late afternoon, her back hurt. Her hands were raw, and the shop still looked tired. But somehow, it looked a little less lonely. That evening, there was a knock at the front door. Claire looked up. An elderly man stood outside holding a small toolbox. She recognized him immediately. He was the man who had watched her through the window yesterday. When she opened the door, he removed his cap politely. "You must be Miss Donovan." Claire nodded. "I'm Walter Jenkins." He pointed toward the bakery sign outside. "I made that sign almost 45 years ago." Claire looked surprised. "You did?" Walter smiled. "Helen baked the bread. I made things that lasted." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Walter looked around the bakery quietly. "It's strange seeing someone else in here." Claire lowered her eyes. "I still don't understand why she chose me." Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the old display counter and rested one weathered hand upon it. Helen wasn't the kind of woman who explained herself. He chuckled softly. She believed people understood things better when they discovered them on their own. He opened his toolbox. "I noticed your front door sticks. Figured I'd fix it." Claire blinked. "You don't have to." Walter smiled. "I know." But Helen would have. For the next hour, they worked mostly in silence. Walter adjusted the hinges while Claire handed him tools. When he finished, the heavy wooden door swung open effortlessly. "There." He stepped back proudly. "Better than new." Claire reached for her purse. "How much do I owe you?" Walter looked almost offended. "Owe me." He laughed. "Helen never charged me when my wife couldn't afford birthday cakes? I suppose this makes us even." Before Claire could respond, he tipped his cap and walked away. She stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down Willow Street. It was the first kindness anyone outside the orphanage had ever shown her. The next few days passed much the same way. She cleaned, sorted old pans, organized shelves, threw away boxes that had collapsed with age. Then she discovered something unexpected. Inside nearly every cabinet, she found handwritten notes, not recipes, little reminders. "Mrs. Collins likes extra cinnamon. Don't forget Tommy's birthday cake on Tuesday. Save the first loaf for Pastor Reed." Each note was written in Helen's careful handwriting. Claire found herself smiling more often than she realized. The bakery suddenly felt less like a building, and more like a conversation that had simply paused. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning beneath the old cash register, she noticed a photograph wedged between two floorboards. It showed Helen standing outside the bakery nearly 30 years earlier. Children surrounded her. Each one held a cookie almost as big as their face. On the back, someone had written, "Kindness always rises." Claire stared at the words for a long time. She slipped the photograph carefully into her pocket. Late that evening, she finally stepped into the bakery kitchen. It was the heart of the building. Or at least, it had been. The enormous cast-iron oven filled one entire wall. Its surface was dark with age. Wooden mixing bowls lined dusty shelves. Copper measuring cups still hung neatly from tiny hooks. Everything was exactly where Helen had left it. Claire gently ran her fingers across the old countertop. "I don't even know how to bake," she admitted with a nervous laugh. She searched through drawers until she found an old recipe book. Its leather cover had cracked with time. The pages smelled faintly of vanilla. The first recipe wasn't pie, or bread, or cookies. Instead, tucked inside the front cover, was a folded note. It read, "If you're reading this, welcome." Claire's heartbeat quickened. She unfolded the paper completely. "The recipes will teach you how to bake. The people of Maple Creek will teach you everything else." There was no signature. She smiled despite herself. "Helen." The woman felt strangely present, not like a ghost, more like someone whose kindness had soaked into every wooden shelf and every worn countertop. Claire turned the page. The recipes were beautifully handwritten. Apple pie, honey bread, blueberry muffins, cinnamon rolls. Each one included tiny notes in the margins. Best on rainy mornings. Mrs. Carter always preferred less sugar. Bake this when someone has forgotten how to smile. Claire laughed softly. I didn't know recipes could sound like letters. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't thinking about being alone. She wasn't thinking about the future. She was simply reading, learning, beginning. As she lifted the heavy recipe book from the counter, she noticed something strange. The book had been resting on a wooden panel that looked slightly newer than the surrounding countertop. She frowned. That's odd. Curious. She pressed gently against it. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. Then she noticed a tiny brass keyhole, almost invisible beneath years of flour and dust. Claire knelt closer. A keyhole. Her heart began beating just a little faster. She remembered the small antique key tucked inside the envelope with Helen's letter. The lawyer had said it belonged to the bakery. Until now. She had no idea what it unlocked. Claire hurried upstairs, opened her suitcase, and reached into the side pocket where she had carefully wrapped the little brass key in a handkerchief. She hurried back downstairs. The bakery was completely silent. Rain tapped softly against the front windows. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily. Claire slipped the tiny key into the hidden lock. For a moment, she hesitated. It felt strangely important, like standing at the beginning of a story someone else had started decades ago. She took a slow breath. "All right, Helen," she whispered into the quiet bakery. "I'm listening." Then, she slowly turned the key. Claire Donovan didn't breathe. The tiny brass key turned with surprising ease. Then, click. The sound was almost delicate. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to tell her that somewhere beneath the old countertop, something had finally opened. For a second, nothing happened. Claire slowly pulled the key back out and looked at the wooden panel again. It still appeared solid. She frowned. Did I unlock the wrong thing? Carefully, she ran her fingers across the smooth wood. Then she felt it. A narrow groove, almost invisible. She slipped her fingertips underneath and gently lifted. The panel rose only a few inches before stopping. It wasn't heavy, just old. Hidden beneath it was a shallow wooden compartment stretching nearly the entire length of the counter. Claire stared in silence. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. It looked as though no one had opened the compartment in decades. Inside lay several objects, each carefully arranged. A small bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. A leather-bound journal. An old brass pocket watch that had long since stopped ticking, and a simple wooden box no larger than a loaf of bread. Claire reached for the journal first. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of careful handling. Embossed on the front, in fading gold letters, were only 2 words. Kindness Ledger. She smiled softly. So this is what you've been hiding. She carefully opened the cover. The pages weren't filled with recipes, nor business records. Instead, every page carried the name of a person, A date, and only a few handwritten lines. January 14th, 1987. Mr. Arthur Collins. Lost his wife today. Send apple pie every Friday until he smiles again. Claire slowly turned another page. March 3rd, 1991. Emily Foster. 8 years old. Birthday tomorrow. Chocolate cupcakes. No charge. Another page. December 18th, 1996. Mrs. Green. Heating bill too high this winter. Leave fresh bread on her porch before sunrise. Don't let her know who brought it. Claire sat back quietly. These weren't customer orders. They weren't financial records. They were quiet acts of kindness. Invisible gifts. Page after page revealed the same pattern. A widow who had lost everything. A veteran struggling to begin again. A family whose house had burned down. A little boy whose father never returned home. Every story ended with the same 2 words. No charge. Claire lowered herself onto one of the old stools behind the counter. She wasn't reading the history of a bakery anymore. She was reading the history of compassion. For decades, Helen Whitaker had quietly cared for people without asking for recognition, without expecting repayment, without telling anyone. Claire kept reading. The names changed. The years passed. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Life moved forward. But Helen's kindness never seemed to stop. Claire felt something shift deep inside her. She had spent her entire childhood believing kindness always came with conditions. Someone helped you because they wanted something. Someone smiled because they expected something in return. But these pages told a completely different story, one she had never imagined. She untied the faded blue ribbon around the bundle of envelopes. The first letter was written on fragile, cream-colored paper. Dear Miss Whitaker, you never knew this, but the bread you left on our porch every Tuesday kept my children from going hungry after my husband passed away. I tried many times to repay you. You always smiled and said the debt had already been paid by someone before me. I never understood what you meant. Maybe one day I will. Claire carefully folded the letter, then opened another. Helen, you probably don't remember the little boy who swept your sidewalk every Saturday after school. I own a construction company now. Whenever I repair a roof for someone who can't afford it, I think of you. You taught me that kindness is the only investment that never loses value. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Her vision blurred slightly. Not because she was crying. Not yet. But because no one had ever described the world this way before. She reached for the small wooden box. Unlike everything else, it had no label. No lock. No carving. She gently lifted the lid. Inside rested a single photograph. It showed Helen Whitaker standing outside the bakery many years earlier. Around her stood a group of laughing children, each holding a warm cinnamon roll dusted with sugar. Helen's smile was gentle, peaceful, the kind of smile that made people feel safe. Claire turned the photograph over. Written neatly across the back were 7 simple words. Every child deserves to feel chosen. Claire stared at them. Chosen. The word echoed quietly through her heart. Her entire life, she had wondered what it felt like. At St. Anne's, she had watched families arrive every few weeks. Children would brush their hair, put on their nicest clothes. Hope. Some left forever. Others waited for another chance. Claire had stopped hoping long ago. Year after year. She watched the front gate open for everyone else. Until eventually, she stopped looking toward it at all. The photograph trembled ever so slightly in her hands. I know that feeling, she whispered. Just then, the little brass bell above the bakery door rang. Claire quickly looked up. An elderly woman stepped quietly inside. She wore a soft blue sweater and leaned gently on a wooden cane. "I'm sorry," she said with a warm smile. "I thought the bakery was still closed." Claire returned the smile. "It is." The woman looked around the shop with unmistakable affection. "I haven't been in sight since Helen passed." Her eyes lingered on the old display cases. "I've missed this place." Claire hesitated. "Were you two friends?" The woman chuckled softly. "My dear." Everyone in Maple Creek was Helen's friend. She slowly walked toward the counter, then stopped. "You must be the young woman she chose." Claire nodded. "I still don't understand why." The woman grew quiet. "You know." There was something Helen always used to say. Claire waited. The woman smiled, as though she could still hear Helen's voice. "The world doesn't change because a few people do extraordinary things. It changes because ordinary people keep choosing kindness, especially when no one is watching." Silence settled gently across the bakery. The woman reached into her purse and laid a $5 bill on the counter. "I know you're not open yet, but when you bake your very first loaf, I'd like to be your first customer." Claire shook her head. "I can't take your money." The woman pushed it back toward her. "It isn't for bread." She smiled warmly. "It's for hope." With that, she quietly turned toward the door. The little brass bell rang once more. Then she was gone. Claire looked down at the counter. Beside the $5 bill, the woman had left something else. A folded newspaper clipping. Curious. Claire opened it. The paper was old and yellowed. Across the top was a bold headline. "Local baker saves children's home from closure." Claire's heartbeat quickened. She read the first few lines. The article described how an anonymous donation had saved St. Anne's Children's Home from shutting down nearly 30 years earlier. Then one sentence caught her attention. Although many suspected Helen Whitaker was responsible for the donation, she refused to confirm or deny the story. Claire froze. St. Anne's. Her orphanage. She slowly lowered the newspaper. The quiet bakery suddenly felt different. More personal. Could this really be a coincidence? Or had Helen Whitaker's life crossed paths with hers? Long before either of them knew it, Claire looked back toward the hidden compartment beneath the counter. For the first time, she wasn't searching for answers about the bakery. She was searching for answers about herself. And somewhere deep inside, she could feel the truth beginning to unfold. Helen Whitaker hadn't simply left her a bakery. She had left behind a trail. One quiet act of kindness at a time. Claire Donovan didn't sleep much that night. The newspaper clipping lay on the little kitchen table upstairs beside Helen Whitaker's handwritten note. Every few minutes, she looked at them again. The orphanage. The anonymous donation. The bakery. None of it made sense. If Helen had been helping St. Anne's Children's Home for decades, why had she never visited? Why had she never introduced herself? And why leave everything to one girl who had never even known her name? Questions filled the silence long after the town had gone to sleep. By sunrise, Claire had made up her mind. If the answers existed, they were somewhere in Maple Creek. The following morning, she carried Helen's kindness ledger under her arm and walked to the public library. It was a modest brick building just off the town square, with flower boxes beneath every window and a bell above the front door that sounded almost as old as the bakery's. Inside, rows of worn wooden shelves stretched toward the back of the room. The scent of old paper filled the air. Behind the front desk stood a man in his early 60s arranging returned books. He looked up over his reading glasses. "You must be Claire." She smiled politely. "I've become that easy to recognize." He laughed. In Maple Creek, You became local news the moment you unlocked Helen Whitaker's front door. He extended his hand. I'm Noah Brooks, the town librarian. I knew Helen for nearly 30 years. Claire's heart skipped. You knew her. I did. Everyone thought they knew Helen. He smiled gently. The truth is, I'm not sure anyone ever knew all of her. Claire placed the newspaper clipping and the ledger on the desk. I think she helped my orphanage. Noah adjusted his glasses before reading the faded article. After a long silence, he nodded slowly. I always suspected, but Helen never talked about the people she helped. She believed kindness lost something the moment it became a story people told about themselves. Claire lowered her eyes. She never wanted credit. No, she wanted people to feel dignity. Those words stayed with Claire. Not gratitude, not recognition. Dignity. There was a difference. For the next 2 hours, Noah helped her search through old newspaper archives. Helen's name appeared only a handful of times. Never for awards, never for charity. Mostly small community notices. Whitaker's Bakery donates bread during winter storm. Local baker provides Thanksgiving meals. Annual Christmas Cookie Day returns. Simple headlines. Nothing remarkable. Yet, the deeper Claire looked, the more one pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time someone in Maple Creek faced hardship, Helen somehow appeared nearby, quietly, without cameras, without speeches, without anyone asking. Claire finally looked up. Did she ever stop helping people? Noah smiled sadly. I don't think she knew how. Before Claire left, Noah handed her a folded piece of paper. Take this. She unfolded it. It was an address. Who's this? Arthur Collins. Claire recognized the name immediately. The first entry in the kindness ledger. Lost his wife today. Send apple pie every Friday until he smiles again. Noah nodded. He still lives here. If anyone can help you understand Helen, it's Arthur. Arthur Collins lived in a small white farmhouse just outside town. The porch sagged slightly with age. A wind chime made from old silver spoons danced softly in the breeze. Claire hesitated before knocking. An elderly man opened the door. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes remained warm. Mr. Collins. Yes, my name is Claire. I inherited Helen Whitaker's bakery. The old man's expression changed instantly. For a brief moment, he simply smiled. So, Helen finally found you. Claire froze. What do you mean? Arthur looked surprised by his own words. I suppose she never told you. Claire shook her head. I never even met her. He invited her inside. The living room was simple. Photographs covered nearly every wall. One picture caught Claire's attention immediately. Arthur and a smiling woman stood outside Whitaker's bakery, holding an apple pie. Arthur noticed her looking. My wife, Eleanor. She loved Helen's pies. His voice grew quieter. The first Friday after Eleanor passed away, I came home and found an apple pie sitting on my porch. No note. No name. I knew exactly who left it. Claire smiled faintly. The ledger says she brought you one every Friday. Arthur chuckled softly. I didn't know she'd written that down. He looked toward the window. You know what the funny part was? I never ate much pie. Claire looked puzzled. Then why did she keep bringing it? Arthur's eyes glistened. Because Helen knew. The pie wasn't for my stomach. It was to give me a reason to open the front door every Friday. Silence settled between them. Arthur continued quietly. Some weeks we'd talk for 5 minutes. Some weeks I couldn't say a single word. But every Friday, someone reminded me I hadn't been forgotten. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes. Helen had never been delivering desserts. She had been delivering hope. As Claire prepared to leave, Arthur walked her to the porch. Just before she stepped down, he asked softly, "Has anyone shown you the bench?" The bench. He pointed toward the town square in the distance. "Go there this afternoon. You'll understand." Later that day, Claire found the bench. It sat beneath an enormous maple tree facing the bakery. A small bronze plaque was fastened to the backrest. She brushed away fallen leaves and read the inscription. "In loving memory of Helen Whitaker. She taught this town that no one should ever carry life's burdens alone." Claire slowly sat down. For the next hour, people passed by. A mail carrier, 2 schoolchildren, an elderly couple, a young mother pushing a stroller. Almost every person paused beside the bench. Some touched it gently. Some smiled. Some simply sat for a moment before continuing on. None of them seemed to realize someone was watching. It wasn't a memorial. It was a habit. A quiet way of remembering the woman who had quietly remembered everyone else. Claire looked across the street toward Whitaker's bakery. For days she had believed she had inherited an old business. Now, she wasn't so sure. Perhaps Helen had never intended to leave behind a bakery at all. Perhaps she had left behind a promise that someone would keep the light on, keep the oven warm, keep the door unlocked, so that whenever life became too heavy for someone to carry alone, there would always be one place in Maple Creek where they would be welcomed with kindness. As the afternoon sun settled across the town square, Claire whispered something she hadn't expected to say. "I think I'm beginning to understand. Not why Helen had chosen her. Not yet. But why this little bakery had mattered so much. And for the first time since stepping off that bus, Claire stopped wondering whether she belonged in Maple Creek. Instead, she began wondering how she could become the kind of person Helen Whitaker had believed she already was. The next morning, Claire Donovan unlocked the bakery before the sun had fully risen. For a long moment, she simply stood in the doorway. The familiar scent of old wood and vanilla greeted her once again. Only now, it felt different. Just a week earlier, she had looked at Whitaker's bakery and seen a forgotten business. Now, she saw something much larger. She saw every apple pie left quietly on Arthur Collins' porch, every loaf of bread placed outside a struggling family's door before sunrise, every birthday cake baked for a child whose parents couldn't afford one, every unseen act of kindness recorded inside Helen's worn leather ledger. The bakery had never simply sold bread. It had quietly carried an entire community through its hardest days. Claire took a slow breath. "I don't know if I can be you, Helen," she whispered. "But maybe I can begin by learning." She tied on one of Helen's faded aprons. It was slightly too large. The fabric smelled faintly of flour and cinnamon, as though decades of baking had become part of the cloth itself. Claire opened the recipe book. She flipped carefully through the worn pages until she found the simplest recipe. Country white bread. No fancy decorations. No complicated techniques. Just flour, water, yeast, salt, and patience. She smiled nervously. Let's not burn the building down. The first attempt wasn't encouraging. She measured too quickly, added too much flour, forgot how long the dough needed to rise. By lunchtime, what came out of the oven looked more like a brick than a loaf of bread. Claire stared at it, then laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd had in days. "I don't think even the birds would eat this." She placed the loaf on the counter anyway, a reminder that every beginning looked awkward. She tried again and again. The second loaf collapsed in the middle. The third was so dry it nearly crumbled apart. The fourth looked promising, until she realized she had forgotten the salt. By late afternoon, flour covered nearly every surface in the kitchen. Claire's cheeks carried streaks of white where she had absent-mindedly brushed away loose strands of hair. She looked exhausted, but she refused to quit, because for the first time in her life, failure didn't feel like rejection. It felt like learning. Just before sunset, the little brass bell above the front door rang. Claire hurried out from the kitchen. Walter Jenkins stood there holding a paper sack. "I smelled bread." Claire laughed awkwardly. "You must have an excellent imagination." Walter looked toward the kitchen. "I've been smelling burnt flour since lunchtime." Claire buried her face in her hands. "It was that obvious." "Oh, absolutely." He smiled kindly. But Helen's first bread wasn't much better. Claire looked up. "It wasn't." Walter chuckled. "Her first pie exploded." Claire blinked. "Exploded. Covered half the kitchen." He laughed so hard his shoulders shook. Helen used to say the only thing worse than bad baking was giving up after bad baking. Claire couldn't help laughing with him. Walter held up the paper sack. "I brought supper." Inside were 2 bowls of homemade chicken soup and a small apple pie from the diner. "I figured you'd forgotten to eat." Claire's smile slowly faded into something softer. "You didn't have to." "I know." Walter looked around the empty bakery. "But somebody once did the same thing for me." As they ate together at one of the old wooden tables, Walter glanced toward the recipe book lying open on the counter. "You know why Helen never locked that cookbook away." Claire shook her head. "Because she believed recipes weren't secrets. They were gifts." He took another spoonful of soup. The real secret wasn't how she baked. It was how she remembered people. Claire thought about Arthur, about the old woman who had left $5 on the counter, about the children in the faded photograph. Maybe Walter was right. Maybe anyone could learn to bake. But remembering people, that was something entirely different. The following morning, Claire made a decision. Instead of waiting until she felt ready, she would open the bakery. Not officially, just for a few hours. The display cases were still mostly empty. Only 6 small loaves of bread rested on the shelves. None of them were perfect. Some leaned slightly to one side. Others were darker than they should have been. Claire made a little handwritten sign. "Fresh bread today. Please be patient. I'm still learning." She taped it to the front window. Then she unlocked the door. For nearly an hour, no one came. Claire pretended to dust the shelves while secretly watching every person who walked past. Most smiled politely. Some waved. But they kept walking. She couldn't blame them. Why would anyone buy bread from a girl who had never baked professionally? Then, just after 10 o'clock, the little brass bell rang. The elderly woman with the blue sweater stepped inside. The same woman who had left the $5 bill. She smiled. "I see you've opened." Claire smiled back. Only a little. The woman walked slowly toward the display case. "I'll take 1 loaf." Claire hesitated. "I should warn you, it may not be very good." The woman laughed. "My dear." "I'm not buying the bread." Claire looked confused. "I'm buying your courage." Claire carefully wrapped the loaf in brown paper. The woman handed her the same $5 bill she had left a few days earlier. "This time," she said with a wink, "I'm actually buying something." As she reached the door, she paused. "Oh, one more thing." She broke the loaf in half, then walked outside, through the front window. Claire watched her cross the street and hand half the bread to an elderly man sitting alone on a bench. The two of them smiled, then began talking. Claire stood perfectly still. The bread had become an excuse, just like Arthur's apple pie. It had never really been about food. Word spread quickly through Maple Creek, not because the bread was extraordinary. It wasn't. But because Whitaker's Bakery had opened its doors again, by the end of the afternoon, 4 more people had stopped by: a retired schoolteacher, the local mail carrier, a young mother carrying a sleepy little girl. Each bought something small. Each spent more time talking than shopping. Each left with a smile. As Claire swept the floor that evening, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. People didn't come here because they needed bread. The grocery store sold bread. The supermarket sold cakes. They came here because this place reminded them of someone who had once cared about them. And somehow, by simply opening the door, Claire had begun caring for them too. Just before closing, Noah Brooks walked into the bakery carrying a dusty cardboard box. "I found these in the library archives," he said. "They belonged to Helen." Claire opened the box carefully. Inside were dozens of old recipe cards, photographs, community newsletters, and beneath everything else, a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Helen Whitaker's unmistakable handwriting, were just 6 words: "For the day hope returns." Claire's fingers trembled. She looked at Noah. "Should I open it?" He smiled gently. "I think—" Helen already knew exactly which day you would ask that question. Claire Donovan didn't open the envelope right away. She simply held it in her hands. The paper had yellowed with age, and the edges were soft, as though Helen Whitaker had touched it many times before sealing it. Across the front, written in her familiar handwriting, were the words, "For the day hope returns." Claire looked at Noah. "What if I'm not ready?" Noah smiled gently. Helen had a gift. Claire looked up. For what? For knowing when people were. The bakery had grown quiet again. Outside, evening settled softly over Maple Creek. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the front windows, painting warm streaks of gold across the old wooden floor. Claire slowly broke the seal. Inside were several folded pages. On top rested a smaller envelope with her name. Claire Donovan. Her heart skipped. She unfolded the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Helen's. "Dear Claire, if you're reading this, then you've stayed. That tells me more about your heart than anything else ever could. Most people would have sold the bakery. Some would have walked away the moment they saw the debt. Others would have stayed only long enough to see if there was money hidden inside these walls. But you stayed because you wanted to understand. That is why I chose you." Claire lowered the letter for a moment. She hadn't realized she was crying until a tear landed softly on the paper. She wiped it away quickly, then continued reading. "You have probably spent your whole life wondering why no one came for you. I know that feeling better than you imagine." Claire frowned. "Helen. An orphan." She continued. "I was 8 years old when I lost both of my parents. There was no orphanage for me. Only relatives who took me in because they felt they had to. I learned very young that loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from believing you were never truly chosen." Claire felt every word settle into her heart. For the first time, Helen wasn't simply the woman who owned a bakery. She was a little girl who had once carried the same emptiness. The letter continued. "Many years later, after the bakery finally began to succeed, I promised myself one thing. No child in this county would ever feel forgotten if I could help it. So every Christmas, every birthday, every difficult winter, The bakery quietly shared what it had. Sometimes it was bread. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was simply letting someone know they mattered. Claire thought of the kindness ledger, Arthur's apple pie, the bread left on porches before sunrise. Every story suddenly made sense. Helen had never been trying to save a town. She had simply refused to let anyone feel as invisible as she once had. Claire turned the page. Halfway down, another paragraph caught her attention. She read more slowly now. The first time I saw you, you were 9 years old. Claire froze. Her breathing stopped. 9. She continued. I visited St. Anne's Children's Home every December with boxes of cinnamon rolls. Most of the children ran toward the treats before the boxes touched the table. You did something different. You waited. Then you carried your roll to a little boy who had been crying because the older children had taken his. You smiled, broke yours in half, and handed him the bigger piece. Claire closed her eyes. The memory returned with startling clarity. A little boy named Ben. He had been 6. Someone had pushed him aside. She hadn't thought about that day in years. Helen continued. You never knew I was watching. But in that moment, I saw something I had spent my whole life believing. Kindness cannot be taught. It can only be protected. Claire pressed her hand against her mouth. Helen had known her. Not well, not personally, but long before the will, long before the bakery, long before Claire had ever heard her name. The room had become completely silent. Even Noah sat without speaking. Claire continued reading through blurred eyes. People often asked why I never had children. The truth is, life simply unfolded differently than I expected. But over the years, I realized something important. Love is not measured by who carries your name. It is measured by whose burdens you are willing to carry. You owe me nothing, Claire. Not success. Not profit. Not even this bakery. If one day you decide to leave, leave without guilt. But if you choose to stay, promise me only one thing. Leave this place kinder than you found it. Claire couldn't stop the tears anymore. They fell quietly onto the pages. She had spent 19 years believing she had entered this world unnoticed, unwanted, and chosen. Now she realized. Someone had quietly believed in her for an entire decade. Without asking for anything in return, Noah gently cleared his throat. There was one more envelope. Claire looked down. The smaller envelope still rested beneath the letter. Her own name written across the front. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a faded photograph. A group of children stood outside St. Anne's Children's Home, holding cinnamon rolls. Near the back of the group, a little girl with dark hair smiled shyly at the camera. Claire? She stared at the photograph, then turned it over. Helen had written only one sentence. The world already has enough successful people. It will always need more kind ones. Claire smiled through her tears. I remember this day. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I thought no one even noticed I was there. Noah looked at her kindly. Helen did. The following Sunday, Claire opened the bakery earlier than usual. Not because she expected customers, because she wanted to do something. She mixed flour, water, yeast, salt. Then she opened the kindness ledger to a fresh blank page. For a long time, she simply stared at it. Finally, she picked up Helen's old fountain pen. Carefully, she wrote the first new entry. Sunday, Mrs. Eleanor Price bought the first loaf when no one else believed I could bake. Next week, cinnamon bread, no charge. Claire smiled. The handwriting wasn't as elegant as Helen's. The ink blotched slightly in one corner. It didn't matter. Some traditions weren't preserved by copying them perfectly. They survived because someone chose to continue them. As the first loaf finished baking, the familiar scent of warm bread filled the bakery once again. Claire closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving the orphanage, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like peace. She finally understood what Helen Whitaker had truly left behind. Not a business, not a building, not even a bakery. She had left a way of seeing people, a way of loving them quietly, without applause, without recognition, simply because every human heart deserves to know that someone noticed they were there, and as Claire carried the warm loaf toward the front counter, she realized something that made her smile. 19 years ago, she had been the little girl waiting for someone to choose her. Now, without even realizing it, she had become the person opening the door for someone else. Winter arrived quietly in Maple Creek. The maple trees that had glowed with fiery reds and golds only weeks before now stood bare against pale gray skies. Inside Whitaker's bakery, the ovens were warm again. Every morning, before sunrise, Claire Donovan unlocked the front door, tied Helen's old apron around her waist, and began kneading dough while the rest of the town was still asleep. The little brass bell above the entrance had become part of her mornings. Its gentle chime no longer echoed through an empty room. Now it welcomed neighbors, friends, stories, life. It amazed Claire how quickly a place could feel alive again. Not because the walls had changed, because the people had returned. The kindness ledger continued to grow. Every week, Claire added another page. Sometimes the entries were simple. Tuesday, Mr. Walter Jenkins. His birthday next week. Apple pie. No charge. Thursday, Mrs. Eleanor Price. Her grandson coming home from college. Extra cinnamon rolls. Saturday, a little boy named Liam. First day at his new school. 1 chocolate cookie. No charge. She never copied Helen's words. She wrote her own, but the spirit behind them remained the same. Quiet, gentle, unseen. And somehow, that seemed to matter more than ever. One snowy afternoon, a black SUV stopped outside the bakery. Several people looked through the front window before stepping inside. The man leading them wore an expensive coat and polished shoes that looked strangely out of place on Maple Creek's snowy sidewalks. "My name is Richard Lawson," he said, offering a business card. "I'm representing Crescent Development." Claire recognized the name immediately. The company that had spent months trying to purchase the entire block, including the bakery. Richard smiled politely. "We're prepared to make one final offer." He placed a folder on the counter. Inside was a check. The amount made Claire catch her breath. It was enough money to change her life forever. Enough to buy a house, travel, go to college, never worry about bills again. Richard folded his hands. "You've done wonderful work bringing this place back. But imagine what you could do with a fresh start." Claire looked around the bakery. The old wooden shelves, the flour-dusted counter, Helen's faded recipe book, the kindness ledger resting beside the register. For just a moment, she imagined saying yes. No more struggling, no more worrying about money, no more wondering if each month would somehow work out. Then the little brass bell above the door rang. Arthur Collins walked inside carrying his usual newspaper. Behind him came Walter. Then Eleanor Price. Within minutes, several more familiar faces entered, laughing quietly as snow melted from their coats. Richard looked around. "They all come here every day." Claire smiled. Not every day. She looked at the people greeting one another like family. Only when they need each other, Richard remained silent. Claire slowly slid the check back across the counter. "I'm sorry. I can't sell." He seemed genuinely surprised. "Even at that price?" Claire nodded. "Because you aren't buying a building." She looked around once more. "You're asking me to sell a promise?" For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Finally, he closed the folder. "I hope you never regret this." Claire smiled softly. "I don't think I will." Christmas arrived with the first heavy snowfall of the season. The bakery windows glowed with warm golden light. Fresh wreaths hung beside the front door. The scent of cinnamon, butter, and fresh bread drifted all the way onto Willow Street. A handwritten sign stood beside the register. "If today has been difficult, take a loaf of bread. Someone has already paid for it." No names. No questions. Just as Helen would have wanted. Claire never discovered who started leaving money in the small wooden box beside the sign. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes 20, occasionally 100. Whenever the money ran low, someone quietly added more. It became Maple Creek's secret, one no one ever talked about. A few days before Christmas, Noah arrived carrying another box from the library archives. "I found one last thing." Inside was an old guest book from the bakery's 40th anniversary. People had written short messages to Helen. Claire turned the pages slowly. Then she stopped. One message had been written in childish handwriting. The letters were uneven. Some words were misspelled. It read, "Thank you for the cinnamon roll. When I grow up, I want to make people smile too." There was no last name. Only one word. Claire. Her eyes widened. "I wrote this." Noah nodded. "You must have been 9. Claire gently traced the faded pencil marks with her fingertips. She had completely forgotten. But Helen hadn't. She had kept that tiny message for 10 years. As carefully as someone might preserve a priceless treasure. Claire laughed softly through tears. "I thought she was watching me." Noah smiled. "I think." Helen was simply waiting. Christmas Eve arrived. Snow covered every rooftop in Maple Creek. Inside the bakery, every table was filled. Families gathered together. Children laughed over mugs of hot chocolate. Arthur sat near the fireplace telling old stories to Walter's grandchildren. Eleanor Price taught 2 little girls how to decorate gingerbread cookies. Claire stood behind the counter for a moment, simply watching. No one noticed her. And strangely, she didn't mind, because this had never really been about her. It had always been about this. People finding one another. One loaf, one conversation, one small act of kindness at a time. Just before closing, the little brass bell rang one final time. Claire looked up. Standing outside in the snow was a little girl no older than 8. Her coat was too thin for the weather. She stared quietly through the front window. Not at the cookies. Not at the cakes. At the families. Claire recognized that look immediately. She had worn it herself once. The look of someone wondering what it felt like to belong somewhere. Claire walked to the door and opened it. "Hi." The little girl looked startled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was just looking." Claire smiled. "Would you like to come inside?" The girl hesitated. "I don't have any money." Claire glanced toward the small wooden sign beside the register. Then back at the little girl. "You don't need any." She wrapped a warm cinnamon roll in brown paper and handed it to her. The little girl accepted it with both hands, as though it were something precious. "Thank you." Claire knelt slightly so their eyes met. "What's your name?" "Emma." Claire smiled. "Merry Christmas, Emma." The little girl started to leave, then turned back. "Why are you giving this to me?" Claire looked around the bakery. at the warm lights, at the people laughing together, at Helen's old apron dusted with flour. Then she smiled the same gentle smile she imagined Helen had worn so many times before. Because a long time ago, someone did the same thing for me. Emma smiled, then disappeared into the softly falling snow. Claire stood quietly in the doorway long after she was gone. Snowflakes drifted through the glow of the bakery lights. For the first time in her life, she finally understood what Helen Whitaker had spent 40 years trying to build. It had never been a successful bakery. It had never been about recipes, or profits, or even bread. It was a place where people arrived carrying invisible burdens, and left feeling just a little less alone. Claire looked toward Helen's old ledger resting beside the register. Tomorrow, she would add one more entry. Not because anyone would ever read it, but because some promises deserved to live on. And as the little brass bell gave one last gentle ring before the lights were turned off, Whitaker's Bakery quietly continued the tradition that had begun decades earlier, one heart at a time. People often believe that life is changed by extraordinary moments, but Claire Donovan discovered something very different. More often, life is changed by the quiet moments no one else ever sees. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a warm smile, a handwritten note, a stranger choosing kindness when no one is watching. For 19 years, Claire believed she had been forgotten. She thought no one had ever chosen her. But Helen Whitaker had seen something in a little girl long before Claire ever knew her name. Not because Claire was extraordinary, but because she was kind, and Helen understood something most people never do. Kindness is the only thing that becomes greater when we give it away. Late on Christmas Eve, after the bakery had grown quiet, Claire opened the kindness ledger one last time. She turned to a blank page and picked up Helen's old fountain pen. Slowly, she wrote, December 24th. Emma needed a warm cinnamon roll, needed to know she mattered. No charge. Claire smiled as she closed the book. Another story had begun. Another small act of kindness had found its place. Just then, the little brass bell above the bakery door rang. Emma stood outside holding the cinnamon roll Claire had given her. Beside her was a little boy. Without saying a word, Emma broke the cinnamon roll into 2 equal pieces and handed him half. Claire stood perfectly still. Years earlier, a little girl at St. Anne's Children's Home had done exactly the same thing. Helen had seen it. Now Claire was seeing it too. In that quiet moment, she finally understood. Helen had never left her a bakery. She had left her a legacy. People still ask what made Whitaker's Bakery so special. Some say it was the bread. Others insist it was the cinnamon rolls. But those who truly knew Helen always smiled at that question, because the secret ingredient was never found in a recipe. It was kindness, shared quietly, passed from one heart to another, generation after generation. Before you leave today, think about someone whose kindness changed your life. Perhaps they never knew the difference they made. If you'd like, tell us their story in the comments. Someone reading your words may find the hope they need today. As Claire turned off the lights and locked the bakery door, the little brass bell gave one final, gentle ring. Not as a goodbye, but as a reminder. Somewhere,